Hi, Rachel here for Wonky Chart. The national debt clock, 15 trillion and climbing fast. The balance on our national credit card. How did we get into this mess? Make yourself comfortable. It's a little involved. The U.S. has experienced 6 great surges in government debt over its history, usually associated with wars. Let's concentrate on the last 2, paying for World War II and the one that concerns us now, a debt bomb that started ticking in the early 1980s and that threatens to explode national finances today. On past occasions, we managed to pay down public debt to manageable levels. We're nowhere close right now. What do we need to do to get there? This is cumulative public debt from 1940 to 2011 in straight, unadjusted dollars. This is the least informative way to examine dollars over a long span because period dollars fail to take into account the effects of inflation on the purchasing power of ours or any country's currency for that matter. Using chained dollars with inflation factored in provides a more representative picture, but it still leaves something out: the capability of the borrower to pay back debt. Say you earn $26,000 a year, which is the current median salary in this country, but you also owe $26,000 on your Visa card. You have a serious debt problem. But if you find a new job that pays $100,000, the $26,000 doesn't matter so much to you. Uncle Sam is stuck with his job, but when the economy grows, so does his salary automatically. Economic growth, more people working, more goods being produced and sold, and so forth, increases Uncle Sam's income relatively painlessly. Tax rates can remain the same, while Uncle Sam's paycheck goes up because of the incremental economic activity. The third method is to measure the magnitude of debt against our national paycheck, gross domestic product, usually called GDP for short. This chart looks at debt as a percent of the GDP between 1940 and 2011. I'll be using debt as a percent of GDP and chained dollars. If you prefer to look at debt in pure unadjusted dollars, they're in section 2 in Wonky Chart. This is a tale of 2 debts. We had a spike to $3 trillion during the war, followed by a gentle slope downward until the early 1980s. That's when the trouble started. This chart shows cumulative debt as a percentage of GDP and mirrors the chained dollars chart. From a high of 121.7% in 1946, debt fell to a low of 33.2% of GDP in 1980. Then came the surge, with cumulative debt peaking at 67.2% of GDP in 1996, followed by a short period of decline that ended at 56.4% of GDP in 2001. Then another sharp uptick that accelerated in 2008 and now stands at 100% of GDP and climbing. What's different? What did our parents and grandparents do to keep debt under control where it's definitely not now? 3 major factors directly correlate to public debt. There are plenty of others to consider, such as the size and scale of a country's labor force, but 3 matter the most. 1, the economy. 2, government spending. And 3, what government collects and taxes and other fees, revenues. Let's look at these 2 tales to see what did and didn't happen. I won't dwell on the economy because that hasn't been the problem, at least until the last decade. As this chart shows, average annual growth in GDP over the 7 decades since World War II has been good to outstanding. Note that the 2000s was not a good decade for the economy, with GDP growing at an average pace of 1.7% annually, half the rate of the previous 3 decades. We've had wars and economic downturns over the past 31 years, 2 particularly nasty recessions, the first in 1981, and we're still dealing with the fallout from the Great Recession that began in December 2007. We've had our problems, but so did the greatest generation and their parents, Korea and Vietnam, plus 6 recessions, including a particularly bad one touched off by OPEC, slapping an oil embargo on us for supporting Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. With all the ups and downs, the bottom line is this. In 1980, the U.S. economy was almost 3 times the size it had been in 1950. The U.S. economy closed 2011 at $13.3 trillion, nearly tripling in size again over the next 31 years. It's not the economy. Let's turn our attention to the second component, spending. In the 30 years from 1950 to 1980, increases in outlays, spending, averaged 4.6%. From 1981 through 2011, increases in spending averaged 2.8% annually. Actually, they're spending more in the first 30-year period than they have in the last 30 years. This chart shows cumulative debt in chained dollars. Again, debt fell to a low of $1.84 trillion before climbing slightly over $2 trillion late in the decade. Look at the same years in outlays as a percentage of GDP. Spending was on a gradual upward slope to 21.7% in 1980. If we add a trend line to smooth out the ups and downs, it becomes even more apparent. Despite upping spending, the federal government managed to cut the deficit as a percentage of the economy from 121.7% to a post-war low in 1980. One reason, of course, was that the economy was 191% larger in 1980. We could afford to spend more on the public sector without debt payments gobbling up most of the government's budget, because the economy, and consequently revenues, were much larger. What did the greatest generation and their parents do? They depended on economic growth and practiced moderation in spending, even though they started several new programs, notably Medicare and Medicaid, strengthened the social safety net in general, and spent lavishly by today's standards on infrastructure. Eisenhower built the interstate highway system in the 1950s, for example. We went to the moon in the 1960s. On the revenue side, they kept taxes high by today's norm. At the close of World War II, the top marginal tax rate was 94%. Over the years, as the debt became more manageable, tax rates were gradually lowered, but the top rate was still 70% in 1980. That's how they managed to cut Uncle Sam's credit card balance to 33% of GDP.